So today's nifty building is really going to be the nifty buildings of the Distillery district. This is really where Christmas in Toronto happens.
It's nifty building.
I've always sort of wondered why the Distillery was where Christmas happened. I wondered if there was some sort of organic transition over time, as maybe leftover brew at the end of the year would be all sold off in bulk and people would gather here to buy it, or maybe artists moved in as the area deindustrialized, and that's why there's so many sort of studios around. It's not really the case. In fact, the whole area has a little bit of faux history about it, so let's jump into that. All over the Distillery district, you'll see these Gooderham and Wart signs boasting that they've been brewers of fine whiskeys since 1832. That's not really true. And if you go on the official version of the history, they claim that a windmill was built way out in the wilderness here that Warts committed suicide into. While I do think there was a windmill here, I don't really think it'd be fair to say this area would be wilderness in 1832 even. The city had definitely encroached into this whole area by then. Most of this area, like the area that I'm standing on right now, actually would have been the lakeshore at the time. This would have been Gooderham Wharf sticking out into the water. It would not have been the Distillery district that we know it today. Most of it is built on infill land. Toronto Front Street used to be the front of Toronto on the waterfront, and then eventually that moved down to Lakeshore, was the shore of the lake, and then Queen's Quay was the quay along the lake. And I hope that when they choose the next road that goes probably somewhere here, that they'll go with a name that doesn't indicate that it's the edge of the water. This is because in a time before pollution existed, they would just dump all their garbage into the lake. Now you can't just dump your garbage into the lake for free, it costs $33. Another part of this dubious claim is the fine whiskeys. The reality is most of it would have been put in unlabeled cans, and up until the 50s was pretty much sold as antifreeze for industrial applications. Not really fine whiskey. The actual story of how this complex got built is that there was a large steam mill not far from here, and there's a lot of leftover grain. You can still see grain towers along the water actually from here. And that meant that there was a lot of leftover grain. There was a huge surplus as a result of industrialization and expansion out west, which meant that there was a lot of cheap grain to be had, and that's why it was boiled down into antifreeze here. It's a great example of Victorian industrial architecture. The whole east side of the city used to be these sort of uniform, boring brick buildings connected by strange catwalks, but most of that got torn down as it got decrepit. In fact, you don't have to walk far from the Distillery district to find brick buildings that are all boarded up and quite decrepit, like these ones. They've even got signs boasting about the new developments that are going to go here, a big hotel. So not really a windmill in the wilderness. This large stone building behind me is the first building built in this complex. It was this size back when it was first opened, so this was always intended to be a big industrial complex. And the reality is that this is just a pretty useless parcel of land, and that's why it went so long without being developed. By the 70s, most of the Victorian industrial buildings in the city had been demolished, and they were starting to get a certain charm about them. So in 1978, a big swath of this was designated a historic zone, and the whole current area was in 1988, which meant that developers couldn't just demolish it like they had most of the rest of the brick buildings like this around. In the 90s, they tried to shoehorn in some condos, but then a recession hit and condos weren't selling for much, so that kind of ended. And then in 2001, some private equity bought up the whole thing and wanted to turn it into this quaint little artists' enclave, and they very much worked hard to make sure that no big brands, other than Mill Street here, which is actually Budweiser under the hood, came into the area. They built a performing arts center. They really walled off a bunch of specific studio space just for artists, and did manage to pretty cleverly work a lot of sort of mixed-use development in, which I think is pretty good. Like, check out this building. It's pretty human scale, commercial down at the bottom, and then there's a playground on top of it, and then on top of that is condos. And this is a very wonderful use of space, I think. It makes the area feel pretty happy, actually. They even convinced the city to put in a streetcar line here as if streetcars would have come to this area. I think it's funny because in most of the rest of the city they're removing these streetcar lines. And with this one, they even originally tried to run it with old stock on it, which means that it was the newest line and had the oldest trains running on it for a while. The entire Christmas market is also a big marketing gimmick to get people to come out here in the winter. It was started in 2010 and was about as popular then as it is now, and every year since they've set up this entire Christmas market as if it's an old tradition or something, and it works pretty well actually. I think that even knowing that the entire history of the place is kind of phony and recently just sort of bolted on to create a story doesn't really take away from the charm. It's still a great place to wander around any time of year, and definitely during Christmas. So after the stone building was built, they had it on a pump house and a few other sort of bonded storage areas and stables and things like that. And you notice that a lot of this building actually happened in 1927, which is kind of odd because that was in the middle of Prohibition actually. It turns out that they were selling a lot of their antifreeze as whiskey for human consumption illegally, and ended up getting dinged with a $500,000 tax settlement in 1927. So they boast about being the biggest taxpayers in Canada all the same. Paying big fines for bootlegging wasn't great for the bottom line, and in the 50s, after they'd mostly divested of most of their antifreeze making capabilities, they were bought up by Hiram Walker, the group that makes Canadian Club. They eventually got sold a few more times, and now actually the Gooderham Wart name whiskey is actually manufactured in Windsor, Ontario, not here at all. They continued brewing things here, mostly again that unlabeled stuff, right up until the 90s though, so that's longer than most industry has continued to operate downtown. For the most part, manufacturing moved out to sort of wartime built facilities, and that's why the urban core de-industrialized a bit. Although there is still the sugar plant here, which I find amazing, and you can even see quite huge bulk cargo boats come in to unload things here all the time. So I still find that one weird than that it works. Anyway, now you know how this industrial complex became a Christmas market. Have a beautiful day. Another dubious claim is the fine whiskey. Most of it would have been put into unlabeled cans and sold as antifreeze. There goes a train.